Greetings and welcome. My name is Ryan O'Rourke from Stay Creative Painting. I truly hope you enjoy today's 10-minute painting. And if you have any questions or inquiries regarding today's tutorial, please leave me a comment in the comment section down below or send me a message over on the Facebook page. I'm always here and happy to help. Speaking of help, if you'd like assistance with the drawing process, I also offer the digital sketch for this 10-minute painting lesson and many others over on the Patreon page, in addition to reference photos and over a dozen hour-long painting lessons as well. So if any of that interests you, go check it out. Again, I am here to help. And now let's jump into today's 10-minute painting lesson. Before we jump into today's painting, I'd quickly like to note that the sketch on the canvas here was done with a fine-tipped Sharpie. I like to use these because generally they show through my first couple of applications of paint and they allow me to see my initial drawing in foreground so that I don't have to go back and reincorporate it after I've done a very messy job of the background as I'm doing here. So that was a big question in the last lesson. I hope that kind of clears things up. But with that said, jumping into today's painting, here I'm using a large damp square-headed brush. I have a good amount of water on my brush to extend the wet life of my paint and so that I can drag my paint out a little bit farther. Then I added a lot of titanium white to my sky. I went back to my palette. I grabbed about an even mixture of titanium white and primary blue. I applied that to the top of the sky and then I began to blend downwards via a series of horizontal strokes until I got something fairly smooth. You can generally get a much smoother aesthetic by applying a very minimal amount of pressure on the canvas. Now here I'm switching over to the medium-sized square-headed brush. Yet again, it's damp. I'm using the same pigment that I applied to the top of the sky to create this mountain, and then I'm grabbing a little bit of Mars Black, applying it to the bottom of the mountain, and then blending upwards. I'm doing this because the light is coming from the background in the painting. It's going to wrap itself around the mountain, and this bottom area is simply not going to be receiving the same amount of light. The top of the mountain is going to be kind of casting a shadow down upon it. The light isn't going to reach this area, and the trees that we're going to have in front of it are also going to play an effect in that as well. Now, with that said, I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush. I'm grabbing some additional titanium white, applying it to the top of the mountain, and kind of working it downwards. This is going to create the effect of a little bit of texture, pathways, and it's going to make it look much more three-dimensional. I'm also going to throw a little bit of a sun up here on the kind of middle of the sky. From there, I'm switching over to an older square-headed brush. This is one where the bristles kind of leaf off in a bunch of varying directions. So when you make a tapping motion with it on the canvas, you get just a litany of implications. It can be absolutely fantastic for rendering a lot of detail very quickly and rendering a lot of very small, subtle detail, such that you couldn't have created with a regular brush. Now, you can make one of these very simply by taking a regular square-headed brush and just kind of peeling back the bristles until you get something that looks a little disheveled. And here I'm taking a mixture of primary red, primary blue, tiny bit of Mars Black, and a bit of titanium white. I'm essentially just creating a base layer for my trees here. I'm doing the tops of them with this tapping motion, and I'm using a bit of a dragging motion just to cover the bottom area where we don't really need any detail. So that's essentially the base layer that we're building right there. From there, we're going to need to add some light to it. We're going to need to create some dimension and depth on it. So I'm going to go back to my palette and grab a slightly brighter version. This simply has a little bit of additional titanium white on it. Now I'm applying this to the tops of the trees and then I'm beginning to blend downwards, but I'm not doing so in the traditional sense. Normally you apply a pigment and you drag it. Here instead I'm applying the pigment with a tapping motion. I'm lifting my brush and I'm doing a secondary tap underneath. Now because I did the initial tap, I've essentially applied the majority of my pigment. The second tapping motion is going to have significantly less. It'll blend more with the initial layer and we'll get something that's much more lesser. As a result, it will look like the top of the line of the trees is very bright, the middle of the trees is kind of a mid-tone, and then the bottom of the trees is a darker tone. And that's really essentially how you create depth in your landscapes. You wrap light around your subjects so that the area of the subject that's closest to the light has the most amount of bright, vibrant colors. Then as you get a little bit farther away, you get your midtones, and then as you get farther and farther away, you get your darker tones. The bottom of the tree line there isn't going to be receiving as much light, so it's going to be a bit darker. From there, I began to add some water into the base of my painting. I used the same blue that we used for the top of the sky. I added white near the trees, and then I created a reflection with a lot of water on my brush. That way it was very transparent, and I used a very soft touch to, again, ensure that it just was fairly transparent. From there, I switched over to that medium-sized square-headed brush again, and I took an even mixture of Mars Black and Titanium White. This rendered a nice gray here, and it's really going to help make the pinks and the violets in the painting pop eventually. Now, I'm essentially just crafting the base layers for my rocks. I'm not adding in any highlights right now. I'm not adding in any darker areas. I'm just getting the shape right. I'm trying to ensure that the rocks that are farther away are smaller and that the ones that are closer to us have a little bit more detail and are perhaps even amalgamated to a point. Then I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush while I wait for that to dry, and I'm beginning to work on my trees. Now I'm using a mixture of burnt umber and Mars Black for this, and I'm trying to ensure that all of my applications are very clean and that they all have a very sharp edge. This is generally best achieved by using a good amount of water on your brush. It's going to allow the paint to be thinned and for the tip of the brush to be very condensed, which is great for this very highly detailed area. But with that said, it will kind of take the opacity of the paint downwards a little bit. It'll be a little bit more transparent, but that is innately something you're going to have to deal with acrylic paints as it is. It just means that you'll have to go back in and do a couple of layers, which really isn't a bad thing because it'll ensure that you're a better painter, that you are constantly remixing colors, that you're getting better at that, and that you can go back and kind of tweak things if you find that you want to change them a little bit. So it really isn't a negative. Here I'm kind of just redrawing in all of those branches. I can still see the initial drawing underneath thanks to that initial Sharpie marker. And now that the rocks have dried to a good extent, I'm taking a bit of a titanium white and I'm incorporating some highlights on the sides of the rocks that I feel will be receiving the most light. So here you can see that I'm leaving some darker areas on the opposite sides. I will do this to both the left and right hand side of the painting, and I'm trying to ensure that some of these strokes are fairly sharp as the rocks themselves are fairly sharp subjects. It's important to keep in mind what type of edge your subject has, whether it be sharp or soft, and use the right brush accordingly. For sharper edges, I generally like these square-headed brushes. For softer edges, for things like clouds and mist, I like the round-headed brushes. Speaking of brushes, I'm switching back over to the older square-headed brush here. I'm taking essentially the same pigment that I used for the trees in the background, and I'm beginning to layer on my base layer. Yet again, this is simply the foundation. We will be going back, we will be adding highlights and darker areas, but we need something to build on top of. I'm still using this tapping motion. Occasionally in the air, I'm rotating my brush, then reapplying the pigment, and this is going to create a slightly different effect every time, which is great because diversity is so important when you're working in landscapes. Now, also worth noting, I'm leaving openings in these clusters of foliage to ensure that we have a little bit of extra depth in our painting as well, and it doesn't look like our trees are too clumpy or cartoonish. The more diversity you can incorporate in your trees, the better and more interesting they will look. Now, much like the trees in the background, we're going to begin adding some highlight. And I'm going to do so by taking a mixture of what we were just using and a little bit of additional titanium white. I'm applying this application on top of the edges that I feel are going to be receiving the most light, and yet again I'm blending back into the clusters where I feel like there's going to be less light and where I feel there's going to be more shadows cast on that area. I'm going to do this to the trees on both the right and the left-hand side, as you can see here, and it's such a cathartic process. It's one of those things where you can just grab some paint and have some fun. It doesn't have to be exact. It's something that you can really play with and work with. I do implore you to ensure that the darker areas of the petals and foliage are still showing through. If you make all of it bright, you will lose that depth, and the idea here is that we are slowly building up all of these highlights. So just make sure that you do leave openings of the initial application. Now I'm also covering portions of the branches but letting some show through as well. That's an important little note that will add some additional depth to your trees. Now, as we get down to the 30-second mark, I'm going in and adding my final highlights to the edges of these trees. They're going to be even brighter than the ones in the background. That way the foreground really stands out. And I'm being much more subtle and picky with these. I want both the initial layer, the secondary layer, and the third layer to all show. I'm not completely covering any of them at all. I did that over the right-hand side. Now I'm also going to move over to the left-hand side and do the same. But that's essentially it for our 10-minute painting. For those of you who do have a little bit more time, who would like to learn a little bit more, I did decide to add a couple extra minutes to the clock and have a little bit of fun and just show you what the painting could evolve into with a little bit of extra time. So here I'm just adding some additional little branches, especially to the top. I'm making them smaller and smaller. I'm adding even more water to ensure that the brush is getting more fine as we move upwards. And I'm also going to go back in and add in some additional foliage. The more detail you add to the piece, the more lived in and real it's going to feel, the more it's going to feel like you could actually explore it. So if you do have that extra time, just do try adding in some extra branches here and there, some extra foliage here and there, and some extra rocks as I've done as well. But there we have it. That is essentially our 10-minute version, our 13-minute version. I truly hope you enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. In it, we talk about how to blend our acrylic paints, when to grab water, how to wrap light around our subjects, all of the things you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. Also, if you want help with the drawing, there is the digital sketch of this up over on Patreon, as well as dozens of hour-long lessons where you also get to see my palette, and we get to spend time doing the things we just don't have time for in these lessons. So if you'd like to see my palette when I'm mixing with water, all of that good stuff, go check out the Patreon, and I'm sure you will be quite happy. Anyways, I post every Saturday. I can't wait to see you next Saturday, and above all, as always, stay creative.